You have now arrived at your destination.
Adam, this is such a joy. I heard so many good things from Mike before the show, so thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Harry. All those bribes to Mike have definitely paid off. I hope I live up to all the hype, and I'm
Wait,
I'm glad to be
you
here.
you were bribing him. I was bribing him too. Mike,
Oh,
what is going on?
he's
This
double dipping.
You know what? This Greylock salary clearly isn't enough for Mike these days. VC life has taken him, huh? Oh, poor Mike. He does the intro and he's been so kind, and we rip him in the
Yeah,
first
you
minute.
throw him
Um,
under the bus right away. Yeah.
But I do want to start. When we look today at some of the growth walks you've been a part of, Patreon, Lyft, I'd love to hear what was that entry into growth for you.
Yeah, so I started my career as what I would call like a quantitative marketer. I tried to be an engineer in school, but I kind of gravitated towards business and consumer psychology instead. Didn't really love engineering. Still love engineers. Don't get me wrong. Love it. Love my engineering friends, but I couldn't be one. And then I was kind of in the right place at the right time early in my career, and I caught this wave of web analytics and experimentation. This was like pre Google Analytics. This is like Urchin, like way back in the day when Offermatica was the only testing tool out there, well before like Optimizely and all these other things. And so I got like really deep into marketing channel and conversion optimization. I think that was like part of the engineer brain that I had. It basically lived in Excel. I started writing front end code as a hobby just when I got bored. And then my career kind of went through this series of step function changes in responsibility and scope. And I had a couple of really big jumps. So the first one was when I left like sort of the kind of cushy public company world, slow moving, and I joined a company called Zimride as their head of growth. And we pivoted Zimride to Lyft in about, I don't know, 4 or 5 months after I joined. And Lyft was like getting a graduate degree in company building. So that was for me now, that was like more than a decade ago. I learned a ton about how to scale a business, like every corner of the product, like no job responsibility was off limits. And it was really like a catalyst for my career growth. And so now I would consider myself more of like a product led growth practitioner. But I've really done everything, right? From like marketing to even like sales and ops and customer success. Like I've led all of that stuff. But now I really focus most of my time and energy on the product experience.
So, I,
And that's what I
so
did at Patreon, et cetera. Yeah.
Well, I want to dive in before we kind of discuss, the meat of the show. I do want to dive into those two experiences with Lyft and with Patreon. Such incredible companies and hyper growth. If you were to isolate one or two key takeaways for you from your time at each, what would they be, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think from Lyft, it's probably the impact of speed on decision making and a healthy relationship with failure. Like, I think a growth person has to be almost immune to failure because you get so many things wrong in your career. Um, but at Lyft, we moved so incredibly fast. And when you move at that pace, there's very few mistakes that are actually permanent. Like, you can almost change anything, right, and reverse decisions. And it really sort of changed my tolerance for making bets and assessing risk. And I've sort of, that's been like the bar that I've held up at every other company that I go to, is how fast we can move, right? So that's Lyft. And then at um, Patreon, I think it would really be like respect and reverence for our customer. So I think one of the things that growth people can get a bad rap for is just sort of being like a bull in a china shop, sort of like growth at all costs, right? But there were more than a few times at Patreon where we did something that seemed like it was in the best interest of our customers, and we were really wrong. And boy, did we hear about it when that happened. When you work with creators, they have the biggest and loudest megaphones on the internet. And you really learn to respect their input into the product building process and decision making. So that's definitely something I picked up at Patreon in my time there.
So normally I have like a structured process with shows and structure, as you saw with the schedule, but I do want to touch on two things before, actually, because they're very relevant to what you just said. You said kind of about the immunity to failure. I agree As long as there's lessons that can be learnt from the failure. And with speed, sometimes there's not the lessons and it's just you kind of fail the same thing. So, how do you think about learning from failure in growth? Is that postmortems? Is that reviews? What is that?
It's sort of all of the above. I think like really we do a lot of experimentation and growth, and that might be prototyping, that might be quantitative experimentation. And you're going to be wrong probably more often than you're right, especially as you do more and more things. It gets harder to be right over the long term. And so what you have to do, like in a failed experiment is fine as long as you take something away from that, you learn something new about your customer, you learn something new about your growth model or your business or whatever. That's sort of super important to me. And so, yeah, I've done it through postmortems. I document experiments really, really well. Make sure that I share that stuff really broadly with the company because everyone can benefit from that stuff that we're learning. And yeah, you just have to develop a thick skin because growth is about taking a lot of shots on goal, structured shots on goal, not just like firing the spaghetti cannon at the wall. But with that structure, you're still going to be wrong a good, healthy percentage of the time. So yeah, so that's how I think about it.
But the second element there, which is you mentioned kind of Patreon and sometimes getting it wrong and customers being upset. How do you figure out whether to use data or whether to use intuition when making growth decisions? Intuition could say, no, I know they will love this. The data might show actually they prefer something else. How do you think
Yeah.
about data versus gut?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I almost never rely on gut. But I also think it's a kind of a failure to over rotate on just quantitative data. So the mistakes that we made at Patreon were typically just looking at numbers and not actually and thinking, oh, these numbers say that if we do this, it's in the best interest of creators. It's going to work great. Like we know what our bounding box is and our error potential. And then, oh, by the way, we forgot to ask a single creator how they would feel about this change. And so when you do that, you learn that just because the data says something doesn't mean that everyone's going to be excited about that. And even could be the majority of people are not excited about that. So I always want to blend quantitative assessments with qualitative discussions with customers, prototyping, like things like that. You can't just do one of those things and expect a fantastic outcome 100% of the time.
It's kind of all tying in, so I'm gonna weave it back to the schedule because otherwise I'll just completely like go off tangent, which is
That's fine.
partly British, but whatever. So I want to start. I'm joking. Actually, Brits are very boring and structured, which is why I hate most of them. But anyway, obviously it's 20 growth, and growth is misused, thrown around too much. How do you define growth and head of growth today? What's that to you?
Yeah, I think you nailed it there. If you ask 10 people about growth, you'd probably get 10 different answers. And on this particular question, so I define growth as the function or functions that understand how a company grows, what levers they have to accelerate that speed and scale, and then can take a measured and tactical approach to testing out those levers, which helps them separate fact from fiction. The overall job of a growth function or a growth org is to connect more people to the value that the company is already creating, get more people to attach, get more people to come back, things like that. So that's typically around acquisition, finding new customers, retention, which is like activating and keeping those customers, and monetization, which is turning those customers into money. So those are sort of like, you're not like inventing things from whole cloth when you're doing growth. You're taking stuff that's already there and you're getting more people to touch it, to experience it, to build habits around it, et cetera. And then
So,
like, yeah,
no, sorry, you go, please. I interrupted you.
I was going to say, and then when you talk about like growth leaders, right, like the VP or the head of growth, that's the person who steers the ship, right? So depending on the stage of the company and the title inflation of the role, this could be a solo practitioner, it could be a manager of managers. Personally, I don't think you should be a head of growth as a solo practitioner because, like, yes, you're the head of growth, but like you're a one person show, right? So I tend to think of the role more in the latter camp, which is like a manager of managers or a leader of a small team. and you're responsible for kind of driving the strategy of your group forward.
Totally agree with you there, especially if it's a team of one. Having a head of is rather ironic. The question is, do you hire a tenured head of growth who can then build out their own team first? Or do you hire younger growth reps, growth engineers, growth product people? What's the right decision, growth leader or growth juniors?
Yeah, I think that's a really it's highly variable. It depends on a few factors. So the first thing I'd say is, do you have a growth model as a company? Has the leadership team, as the founder CEO, done the work of understanding how does this business grow? What do our loops look like? What brings new people to the product? What keeps them around? What monetizes them? So that's like the starting point when you're evaluating. Secondly, then you have to ask yourself, based on this model, do we know what org functions and skills are necessary to iterate on this model and to test out our hypotheses? And then finally, my next question is sort of, how involved does the founder want to be in running the team? Ideally, they want to stay very close and connected to the work, but sometimes they really don't. They want to be very hands off. So if those three things are true, then I recommend hiring someone around like the director level or a touch below that. Someone who wants to be a player coach. You can build processes for testing and iterating on the model. They can create a baseline of data if it doesn't exist. They're really good at communicating, so they can share knowledge across the org and kind of start to build out that team. There's really is like a sweet spot here. Too junior, and you just have a bunch of order takers that can't prioritize their way out of a wet paper bag and figure out what they should be doing, or they've maybe only seen it done one way before, and so they just sort of like want to rubber stamp it and say, well, this worked here, so therefore it must work here. Too senior, and then you don't have a doer. You have somebody who's like, well, I'm here, my first job is to hire 10 people, and that's not very helpful either, because growth's about making progress. And so you need to be making that tangible progress. So you got to kind of find someone in that like sweet spot, mid-level, maybe punching above their weight a little bit.
Totally agree with you in terms of that kind of nuanced director level insertion point there. When we think about their positioning within the org, we hear the hailed Facebook growth teams, which are obviously standalone and, born in heaven. And then, there's other companies which integrate them very much into product or marketing or different functional areas. How do you think about the question of whether growth teams should be standalone or baked into existing functions?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think people have been really hard pressed to try to replicate the Facebook model to a T. Even people who come from Facebook sometimes struggle with that. Like it's never as clear cut, right? So I think where people sit in the org also depends on the growth model and how you grow. So if you have an acquisition problem, a retention problem, a monetization problem, that can really tell you like where and how to focus. And then what your product does and what market you're in can really dictate the channels that are available to you for growth. For example, if your product should really be growing like virally via invitation, referral, collaboration, things like that, then you probably want to start with growth as part of the product org, right? You want to have a product manager that oversees growth. If you've got fantastic retention, if you don't grow that way, maybe your best channels are in paid acquisition for growth, then you might prioritize growth in the marketing org, and you might try to find like a growth marketing hire or something like that. So it really like comes down to where you put someone is dependent on how you should be growing. One thing I'll add to this though is org design is rarely static. As a leader, you've got to make sure that you communicate that, because the only constant in a startup is change, which includes org structure, right? Like I was at Patreon for over 4 years. I was at Lyft for 3 years. We changed things a lot, right? Like what you did, who you worked for, who you reported to. Most of the standalone growth teams that I've seen eventually get folded into one of the other orgs, product, marketing, something like that. But I've also seen teams break out standalone growth teams in order to drive more focus for a period of time, especially if it requires like a few different functional roles in the company, or you're introducing a new loop, et cetera. But there are really like there are pros and cons to each structure. There's no perfect answer. Sometimes you get focus, accountability, good decision making, but then you might also be seen as the cowboys of the org. And depending on the egos of the leaders in charge, that could be a problem if you're not part of their group. The flip side is like in an embedded org, you don't have the organizational tension, but sometimes you have worse focus. So like the number of times where I've heard companies tell me things like, yeah, we're going to get to that. Our growth team's going to get to that right after we work on this core product issue or set up this marketing campaign. Like that's not focus, right? That's not a good growth team. So yeah, so that's
And
my take.
you mentioned the word loop there. When we spoke before, you said about building growth models around growth loops. Naturally, as any, egotistical, insecure VC, I pretended that I knew what you meant and didn't question you. Uh, uh, what did you mean by building growth models around growth loops? And how do
Yeah.
you advise founders on it?
I love the humility of this conversation, Harry. This is great. Just don't tell the other VCs, right?
I won't. No
Um,
one's
uh,
listening. No one's listening.
it's our secret. Nobody hears this. So the growth model is like one of my all-time favorite tools. It's probably the most important thing and foundation to alignment, communication, prioritization, org structure, like all the stuff that we just talked about depends on the growth model. And this is what I teach this at Reforge, where I've been for the last 12 months as an EIR. It's one of the first things I do with advisory clients. Like I've done this now, I don't know, dozens of times with companies. So I start with a growth loop. And a loop is, to like break it down to its simplest thing, a loop is a self-contained cycle where the inputs into the loop become the outputs. So they generate something, and then that feeds back into the top. So I'll give you like a perfect example of this. At Lyft, we had a very strong, what I would call like clinically a financially incentivized viral loop. So this is your classic like give, get, referral structure. I invite you to Lyft and you sign up and you get ride credit. And then once you take a ride, I get ride credit as the inviter. So that invited person then goes on to repeat that invitation for other people. So they become the output of that person joining becomes the next input into the system. That's a really simple loop. So a product experience is comprised of a bunch of these things. And you can build them over time and add them on. And they compound. So they can work on not only acquiring users, but retaining, engaging, helping people form habits, reminding them about the product's value. And so the growth model is when you build this out end to end visually. That's a qualitative growth model. And then when you apply numbers to this to understand the different steps in your loops and the rate of change between the steps, that's a quantitative growth model. But even just like mapping out your loops and creating a simple visual of how you grow and the steps between them is an excellent starting point. It points you at like where are your levers for growth? What should we be leaning into, et cetera. So that's growth model and growth loops.
When you map it out, should there be very few steps? Or question, is it the fewer the better from input to output?
Yeah, I think the advice that I give to people is try to don't overcomplicate it. Try to create as simple of a structure as possible. A typical loop will have maybe between like 3 and 6 steps, depending on the speed of that loop and the complexity of the product. But yeah, I definitely don't build out a loop that has like 47 steps in it, because that's not going to help you with prioritization, right? You're going to look at that and go, well, we're no better off than we were before. It's like too granular in a way. So like to come back to our Lyft example, in that financial viral loop, it's very simple, right? Person signs up, person takes a ride, person invites someone, that person signs up, that person takes a ride. The cycle repeats itself. Within that loop, you've got a bunch of levers for optimization. You have the incentive structure, you have the conversion rate from sign up to taking a ride, you have the rate at which people invite other people, you have the number of invitations sent. Each one of those things is like a concrete lever that can be worked on and improved upon to make that loop spin faster and grow bigger.
I guess at some point, do loops plateau? One, and then two, Should teams have multiple loops concurrently running to ensure efficient growth?
Yeah, there are definitely plateaus to loops, and in Reforge we call that sort of hitting max scope or hitting your horizon. Um,
Mm.
some loops plateau much earlier than others, depending on how much work it takes to keep the loop spinning. So things that are generated by users typically have a much higher ceiling because every new user can generate and participate in that loop. Things that are generated by the company or paid advertising or things like that tend to have lower scopes because there's a limit to that. You hit that limit much faster, and there's much harder like efficiency targets to get over. In terms of like how to have multiple loops, I typically recommend that companies start with a core thing, one core loop, or maybe two core loops that they can really work on for a while. But you have to be able to project that out and see when you're going to start to run out of steam, and then try to sequence into new loops or expand the eligible population that can go into your loop. There's a whole bunch of different strategies to kind of pushing past that scope limiter, which we won't go into excruciating detail on this podcast on. But yeah, there's a bunch of ways that you can do it, including sequencing into new loops.
How do companies that you've advised most go wrong in trying to create loops?
Mm. I think it's a great question. The first thing I would say is they try to think that everything is a loop. It's really only a loop if it is a closed circuit that feeds back into itself. So a lot of people will be like, well, what about business development and partnership? Like that's a loop, right? Like we get this partner and that feeds in here, and then we get another partner. And a lot of times I say, well, okay, in theory, yes, but that's a very slow process. How long is a single cycle of that? And how much work do you have to put in to maintain that? Does getting a new partner close the next partner? Probably not. You still have to put a lot of energy in from like your business development or your M&A or whatever. And so stuff like that is where companies get really hung up. That's one. The second place is trying to have too many loops and focusing on too many things. It's better to narrow and focus on just a core set of things at the beginning and really extract as much value out of those before getting distracted and moving on to the next thing. And so like focus and thinking that everything is a loop are kind of two big problems that I see with a lot of the companies that I work with.
Can you tell me about a loop that you've tried personally that went wrong and what you learned from it?
Oh boy. Yeah, I'll tell you about one. Yes. I mean, right. I talked at the beginning about failing a lot, right? So here's one. Here's one where it you would think in theory that it would work, but really the sort of psychology of the customer is what kept it from working. So the example is let's take an ed tech business. So for a period of time, I was the head of growth for a company called Wyzant, which was the largest tutoring marketplace in the United States. So helping you find a local tutor in your neighborhood. We were masters of SEO, local search for like, I need help with calculus in this zip code. We tried to implement a referral loop like Lyft, where, hey, as a parent, I would invite another person. I would get credit towards tutoring. They would get credit towards tutoring. And we built a really nice system for doing this, and no one used it. And so it was like a pretty historic flop. So then we started talking to people about, well, why aren't you using this? We started like digging into the why of what we were observing. And what we found is that the problem with a invite or sort of referral loop in the United States is that there's a huge stigma associated with needing a tutor. And so parents don't want to tell other parents that their kid is seeing a tutor because it makes them feel like their kid is dumb. And so in and of itself, no one is going to share this product in an active, proactive way. You're not going to bump into somebody in front of the school in the morning and go, hey, little Johnny is struggling in math. Let me recommend this thing to you, because it's almost like an embarrassment for you as a parent. But this is very different than other countries. Like a lot of sort of Asian countries, like tutoring is just embedded in the world. Like it's like a part of what you do. But in the US, not surprisingly, maybe our American exceptionalism here, It's really kind of like a stigma. And so that loop didn't work at all. Even though, if you're doing pattern matching, you would say, oh yeah, sure, it should work. It's money. People like free money. So that was a big one.
I would love for like Roman, erectile dysfunction to do like, hey, Adam, have 10% discount, brother.
Yes,
never used,
exactly.
never
Probably
used it before. Heard from a
no.
friend.
Yeah, a guy I know.
Listen, I want to dive into the hiring process, and so we're gonna take it in the slant that you took it with me, which is that director level, kind of the mid tier, not super junior, not super senior, and we're gonna go with that. How do I literally structure the process, Adam? I've never hired a growth professional before. Can you just walk me
Yeah.
through it from ground zero?
Yeah. So first, my take on this is so I'm going to answer your question, but first, I'm going to say that I have a little bit of a non-traditional answer for like the beginning part of this. Like, I try to interview people on the job, especially leaders. Having gone through a bunch of executive interviews myself, probably like over a dozen times. Um, I think that the traditional interview process for leaders is broken. And the best way to learn about someone is really working side by side with them. I learn a ton about companies just from being an advisor and working with them 1 hour a week, way more than in my conversations leading up to that relationship. However, you need to assess people in some way before you do that. So I'm going to like set my Adam hot take to the side for a second and tell you about like how I would structure an actual interview process for those folks who like really want to do interviews, which I think is most people. So like here's the steps. Pre-work is first. You need to understand what you need. If you're a founder and you've done your job and you have alignment around how you grow, basic growth model, what levers you have at your disposal, then you definitely have a sense for the types of skills and background like you might need. So like don't hire a marketing person when what you really need is a product person. Don't hire a product person when what you really need is a marketer. So that's sort of like my first step. Know what you need. I tend to like what I call like quantitative generalists as my early growth hires. So these are people who can effectively prioritize and have a no pun intended growth mindset. And they're really good communicators because building the growth function requires a lot of knowledge sharing and a lot of confidence building and bringing people along for the ride. So that's sort of one, right? That's my pre-work and like how I think about what I like. I also like failed entrepreneurs for this role because they have a really good appreciation for how important it is to acquire and retain customers. Maybe they built a great product and then they couldn't get anyone to use it. And so like they have a real appreciation for why growth is really important. So that's like step one, like framing like the who, right? Then I write down the core competencies that I want to test against throughout the interview process and figure out how you'll be testing them. So what this looks like is like a quantitative exercise, a prioritization exercise, some sort of behavioral and situational interviewing, and probably a take-home assignment that ends in a presentation where you have to communicate and communicate understanding with people. You really want to like simulate the on-the-job experience as much as possible during this process. So that's
Oof.
sort of like how I set it up.
I need to dive in on these tests. I mean, I
Yes.
got shivers when I heard them. I felt like I was back at school, which was, not that long ago, but I was kicked out, so I don't know if it went that well. But my question to you is, if we go through them, can you just give me an example of what each one means so I actually know? So
Yeah.
number one was what?
A
Quantitative.
quantitative exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
What
your
is
quantitative exercise is maybe you give somebody a dummy data set. And I've actually done this before with growth PMs and things like that. So you give somebody a dummy data set and they have to organize and draw insights from that data set and make recommendations against it. So you might say like, here's a whole list of users and sort of cohort behavior and things like that. What are you observing here? And what do you think this means? They could be wrong, but you want to see how they like manipulate data. Can they build a cohort chart? Can they do some of the basic like building blocks of growth and understand at least quantitatively what are we observing with this set of users? Oh, everyone seems to drop off at week 3. Okay, that's really interesting. What are you going to do with that information? Well, I'm going to dig into what happens in week 3 in the product experience. Are we sending people a communication? Are we not sending people, like all of that sort of stuff? So that's sort of like your quantitative exercise. That's one. Then you've got a prioritization exercise. So the prioritization section might be things like you share some data or sort of snippets of your growth model, and then a list of themes and tactics for them to sort through. And you say, how might you prioritize this based on this data or this knowledge that I'm giving you? And then people will say some things, and then you give them additional constraints and new information throughout, and you see what they do with the prioritization. So do they have a framework? How do they think about the impact and the confidence and sort of like the reach of these different experiments? And so are they effectively like sorting things? Are they applying some sort of, again, framework to figure out how to prioritize? So that's like the second one. That's your prioritization exercise. Very similar to what you do in a PM interview, by the way. But as a leader, prioritization is critical, right? And then there's like the behavioral and the situational interviewing. So this is really designed to get at that growth mindset. It's a lot of the tell me about a time when you did X, or tell me about a time when you observed Y. I think Patreon was kind of the master of this, because we also would do behavioral fit, and we had a system of core behaviors that we wanted people to have, certain like actions that they had demonstrated that they'd taken in the past. And so that's like where all of these come in. Typically, the types of people that you put into this interview situation are not like direct team members. They might be people who are sort of stakeholders or something like that. But they're doing a lot of that behavioral situational interviewing.
And what
then
questions?
the last thing,
what questions do you like to ask there that really test the behavioral elements and essences of whether this person is a prick or not?
Yeah, great question. I ask questions that get at people's level of risk tolerance, grit, and humility. So I ask questions about times where people were sure that they had the right answer to something and they ended up being wrong, and then how they communicated that to folks. I ask people on like how they recovered from that and iterated towards a better outcome. I'll ask questions about their ability to influence. Tell me about a time where you convinced your CEO of something that they were completely on the other end of the spectrum opposed to you. Or tell me about a time where you did something wrong and got a piece of feedback about it. And how did you respond to that feedback? What was it? What did you do with that? How have you learned from it? When have you done better in the future? So I'm really trying to understand their ability to grow and change and, like you said, not be a jerk. If someone is not good at taking feedback or learning, you can suss that out in an interview process. There's a heavy level of ego that you can detect in an interview process by how people answer questions. So yeah, those are some of the things that I ask folks.
I'm never wrong, and when I was, it wasn't my fault.
Exactly. A lot of that, right? Like, where do you seek to blame? Do you point it at yourself? Do you like point it at other people? So as a leader, it's always your fault, right? No matter if it really is. So you want to find folks who have that mentality.
You're right. No, I totally agree with you there. Is that kind of it then? After those 4 stages, is that kind of it? Do we have everything we need? And do we make the offer then?
Yeah, I think like what I left out is this sort of like communication presentation stage. So you want to make sure that people can come in and maybe dissect a business that they like, talk about how it grows, and present an approach to changing it in plain language that a kindergartner could understand, because that's what they're going to have to do at the company, right? And so like that, let's say they've nailed all of those things. I think, yes, it's time to get to an offer stage, but I think like then you may want to get in and do like a real hands-on exercise with someone as like the final step. So maybe that's like a multi-hour brainstorm, or working through like a roadmap together, really seeing like how will they collaborate with you in a working session. So that's a thing. And then of course I can't leave out my back channel references, right? Like I'm constantly sleuthing, connecting to people to try to find out. I mean, you do this as a VC, right? Like You got to know the dirt on someone before you hire them. So,
No, no,
so
that would constitute additional work, and so we tend to avoid all of that. That would
by the
actually
way,
justify fees, and so that would be egregious.
by the
Uh,
way, I have a fantastic story about this about VCs back channeling. Can I tell it really quickly? It's like a 30-second story.
I love a
Okay.
story. Yeah.
So the story is the original Series A investor in Zimride, which became Lyft, was Raj Kapoor at Mayfield. And when Raj was doing his due diligence on John and Logan, Raj somehow found Logan's high school principal and contacted Logan's high school principal from Southern California and asked him about Logan. And he learned this hilarious story that Logan had reprogrammed an auto dialer to call everyone in the school and tell them that school was canceled for the day and threw it into like an uproarious like chaos, right? And so Raj was so impressed by that story and that the principal remembered Logan like a decade after he graduated high school that that was like a big positive signal for him to invest. So I
I
love
love
that though. Like talking to your high school principal, is pretty
what
great.
Also, what an amazing story. That is like an
Yeah.
ingeniously creative child. Okay, so we've made the offer now. We've done those four like pretty stringent processes actually. We made the
Yeah.
offer, they're joining, amazing. Onboarding sucks everywhere. How can I, as a founder and as a leader, make the onboarding process as smooth as possible for my mid-level growth first hire?
Yeah, you're right. Onboarding sucks in the vast majority of companies. Like, and I don't know why. It's not that hard to get right. So the way that I think about this is you got a new hire coming in. They have a ton of momentum and a ton of political capital because they've just made it through your hiring gauntlet, and you're super excited to have them there. Everyone is like, "Great, our savior is here. We're pumped." Those first few months are critical to their success. You think about it like onboarding a customer. This is your activation experience. This is going to drive long-term retention and success of your customer, except now your customer is an employee. So I think about that. I think about it that way. And you've really got to focus setting up this person for success, helping them achieve their first few wins and kind of continue that momentum and capital. So I'm a really big fan of the book. I think everyone should read the book, The First 90 Days. I have a copy somewhere. It may be like right here on my desk. Student of that book. It is fantastic. I recommend it to everyone. So I make sure that we have a really clear and agreed upon 30, 60, and 90-day plan, and that other people in the org know what this plan is. Not only just me and the person I've just hired, but other people that they're going to interact with. So they know how they're spending their time. Month one is basically learning, building relationships, evaluation of the team, if there is a team. Month two is typically iteration and improvement on the growth strategy or creation of one if it doesn't exist. And then month three is really like longer term planning and alignment. And so I set up people with expectations of plans and deliverables at each one of those months. Typically, the plans have decreasing fidelity the farther out you go because it's hard to be certain about 6 and 12 months into the future. But I spend a ton of time with this person in the beginning to help them accelerate their learning curve. I'm talking many hours a week, like side by side. It's crazy to me that some founders don't spend much time with new hires. They're just sort of like, good luck, here you go. This is your job now. And you just spent countless hours interviewing this person. So like now is when the real work starts. So that's how I do it. I break it down in a 90-day plan with clear milestones at each of the 30, 60, 90. So
Okay,
yeah,
so
that's how I get people started.
I love it. Thank you for that. You said about communicating to the wider org. How do you do that? Is that in shared Notion docs? Is that in pipe drives? Is that help me understand? How do you do that and let everyone kind of feel the accountability?
Yeah, well, it's definitely not like flare guns and smoke signals and things like that. Whether or not it's Notion or a Post-it note or a Google Doc or a presentation, like it really depends on the culture of the company and how they communicate. I'm a written communicator. So like when I joined Imperfect Foods as their chief product and growth officer, I built this out in an Excel file or a Google Sheets file, I should say. And I had like specific rows, specific milestones, my plan, and very specific deliverables and what success would look like. And I worked with the CEO who I was reporting to align on this stuff and say, hey, you're good with this? This looks like the work that I should be doing because I think this is the work that I should be doing. And then I shared it with everybody who I was working with, the entire executive team, my own team, which was like 20 or 30 people at the time. So like I just published it far and wide. I was like, hey, whole company, this is a public document. You want to see how an executive spends their time? This is what I'm doing for the next 3 months. I'm a big
Golf.
fan of over communication. So yeah.
Golf. Love it, love it. I totally agree. Okay, so when we think about these new hires, how long do we give if we don't think it's working? Say it's 45 days in, you're like, yeah, the first month of relationship build didn't really go well.
Yeah. Well, look, I think a lot of this depends on the person and the learning curve. So if they've done growth, but they're in a very new industry where they've never like worked in that space, the learning curve is going to be pretty steep. So I typically give people like I give them that 90 days to find their footing and make solid recommendations and get alignment and maybe notch a few small wins in that time. But I think like one of the things that separates the good from the great is a lot of the best people that I've worked with, they come in on day one and they've already been thinking about the business. They've got a plan, they've done some homework, they've done some learning up front. They're asking really thoughtful questions. They've probably done this during the interview process, by the way, and they're moving fast because in growth, time is of the essence. So, like, if you're getting to 45, 60 days and you're not seeing momentum, I'm not talking about like changing the trajectory of the company, because that's hard, right? But I'm talking about like there's a feeling that you can get that this person is working hard and they're moving and they're hungry to understand and build and they're like chomping at the bit to get going. Um, if you're not feeling that like part of the way through that 90 days, it might be time for a conversation, right? And
I,
like
I,
the
some,
level
I,
setting of
some,
expectations.
I think about it as kind of going a bit above and beyond, which is like it is going above and beyond to create a lot of this before you start. But if you're
Yeah.
passionate about the company and how you're going to think about new innovations within the team or the product, you do. And so I think it's just a little bit like actually, could you do 2 months of the 3 month 90 days? Could you do 60 days in 30 days where they've actually coincided it because they've just got so much energy to do so? Do you see what I mean? Like, really,
Yeah.
I totally
Yeah.
agree. Listen, I spoke to some of your friends before this show, speaking of references, and they said you were world class when it came to cross functional communication. So this is tough because not many growth people are, having interviewed quite a few. So what does great cross functional comms look like? And like as granular as possible, what do you
Yeah.
do to make growth an integrated and welcome part of a multifunctional org?
Yeah, I have a pretty strong feeling I know who told you this about me, because he is also a master communicator himself. So I've iterated on this quite a bit, and I have a few frameworks that I follow. So, like, first, one of my absolute like must-have expectations for myself and for anyone that I hire is that they have to over communicate until everyone gets it. That the most knowledgeable person always thinks that everyone else has the same level of understanding as them, and they're always wrong. You have to simplify and over communicate. And I expect like myself and everyone on my team to be the ambassador for our work with stakeholders. It builds trust. It's ridiculously important. Second thing I do is I adjust communication to the person or the group. So sometimes sending that CEO or CFO an email is not the right approach. You've got to sit down and like take them through it in a one-on-one environment and make sure that they really understand the what and the why. That's hard. It's time consuming, but it saves you time in the long run. The third thing that I do is I create reliable, predictable communication streams. So for example, at Patreon, I had a weekly email I started it the first week that I got there. I didn't even know very much about the business, but I started sending this communication. It went out to a core group of stakeholders, leaders, peers, my own team. I called it the Ship It Friday email, which is ironic because you're not supposed to ship things on a Friday, but that's the name. And it had a couple of important sections in it, and they were the same every week. How are we doing? Highlights and lowlights from the week, important learnings about our customers, our growth model, experiments, etc., and what was coming up in the near future. And this email update was so reliable and consistent that if I missed a week because I was like out or like I had to send it on Monday or something, people were upset. They were like, I look forward to getting this communication. It was fun. It was funny. There was an occasionally like a GIF or a meme or like an Easter egg in it. But I had people coming up to me in the company and saying it was the clearest articulation of what an org was working on and the outcomes they were delivering, and people replying and asking questions and giving feedback. And that's how I knew that I was onto something, because people were like engaged with it.
How long did that? I love that. I didn't know this. How long did that take to write?
To write, in the beginning, it took time. It took probably 30 to 45 minutes because I was doing everything myself. Eventually,
That's okay though. 30 to 45 minutes, like bluntly, everyone can find the time for.
it's a really good use of time as a leader. And eventually you find tactics to kind of distribute the work. So you create a template that your team can fill out and submit to you. So as your team grows and you're not in the weeds on everything and you don't have all the knowledge, you create that system so that the team can participate and help you.
I think a big
The
mistake that
last
people, I think a big mistake that people make on something like that in particular, they feel that it has to be perfect. I'm not going to send it out this week because I would say it's better that it's not perfect but goes out. But do you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yes, ship it. The worst case is somebody reads it and they're like, I don't understand. And they write you back and they say, hey, help clarify this. That's actually a good thing. They're giving you feedback. They want to know. They're hungry for information. The
Yeah.
last thing that I would say, like a couple final thoughts on communication. One, the old saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I think a prototype is worth a whole chapter in a book. So I try
Oh,
to communicate with visual aids whenever possible. Um, it's really important. Words on a page are great. A picture of what the thing is actually doing is even better. It's something that people can play with. That's one. And the second thing is I'm not going to say like radical transparency because I don't love the word like radical anything. But I practice transparency, candor, and kindness in all of my communication. I find that it makes me much more likely to get feedback, which makes me better at communicating. It's sort of like a growth loop in itself. I communicate, people read it, they have feedback for me, and I make my communication better. And I still do that today. So,
I think it's
that's my
also just
last thing.
it's about making it human, like you said, with the memes, with the gifs, with me taking the piss out of myself, getting thrown out of school. Otherwise, it's just like this is how you build authentic relationships, and I don't know if
Absolutely.
it's even. I don't even know if it's more productive. It's more fun. um,
That's right.
so yeah. Listen, do want to ask one other thing that I was told about your world class skills, but someone mentioned your insane work on the Patreon rebrand. Tell me, what
Yeah.
makes for a successful rebrand? What's required, and where do many go wrong, do you think?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is there aren't a lot of growth leaders who come into a company and then realize that they need to rebrand and reposition the company because that's the main impediment to growth. But that was the situation I found myself in after joining Patreon. First, I will say, like, I had a lot of guidance and help. I didn't know very much about branding. So I worked with somebody who had done a lot of repositioning. We paid someone to come in outside and kind of work one on one with me. And they were coaching and teaching me, as well as like leading workshops, providing some frameworks and things like that. So, like, don't assume that you know what you're doing, ask for help. That's one. I learned a lot. I know a lot more about what I'm doing now. I could do this again myself, probably without the help. The second thing is that when you're doing work around branding and positioning, there's a lot of teammates who are skeptical that you need to do this work because they're thinking about the day to day and they're like, hey, the business seems fine right now. But they're not necessarily doing the job of the growth leader, which is to look into the future and see that there's a ceiling that you're going to hit. It's not their job to do that. It's mine. So you have to bring everyone along for the ride, especially the CEO and the founder whose baby this company is, right? Like, for example, at Patreon, like this was Jack's thing. He designed the brand, he positioned the business. To go to Jack and say, hey, Jack, this thing needs to be different than what you started it as. Like, that's a tough conversation to have. Same with the skeptical engineering manager, the board, everyone. So if you don't bring people along for the ride, it's going to be a grind to get it done. And then the third thing I would say is I brought a lot of my like growth skills to branding and positioning. So it's really hard to test a brand change. You can't be like, hey, this whole thing looks different. What do you think? A/B test. Like that doesn't really work because you can't go back from that. So we did a lot of customer interviewing, a lot of like qualitative brand blind positioning statement testing, this versus this. And they didn't know we were talking about Patreon, but we built up a lot of confidence that shifting from crowdfunding to membership, which is what Patreon is now, was sort of the right move. And then the last thing that I would say is like really effective repositioning. A lot of people don't realize like your brand is just your words and your visuals. That's the promise that you're making. But the product experience is what really delivers on that promise. And once we had the confidence that we were moving in the right direction, we introduced a whole bunch of new features and functionality at the same time that we updated our look and feel. We rallied the whole company around this, and we continued this drumbeat. And then the last thing that I would say is when we launched the new brand and the look and feel, I prepared people to not look at Twitter for about 2 weeks, which one of our board members told me, don't look at what people are saying about this. So everyone rushes to social media for their hot takes. They don't like this logo. They don't like the way this thing looks. Who designed this? This could be done by a 2-year-old with a crayon. Like everyone's negative about it. And then it all fades away in 2 weeks and people move on because there's another brand that they want to shit all over. So,
And actually,
so that
they
was
get used to
definitely,
it. They like it. They like it. I remember when, like, it's the same with product features. You know, when the home button was removed from the iPhone, it was like, unbelievable. How can we not have a home button? And now
yeah,
it's egregious to have this button at the bottom. So I'm
people hate
totally.
change.
And you know what
Yeah,
the other thing is? I think that when it comes to the branding and the messaging, the devil lies in the neutral, which is like, if you look at so many brands, they don't stand for anything. You're like,
no,
increasing efficiency within teams, and you're like, it's so unattractive. Like the way,
right.
like just be opinionated. I always think.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm gonna get off a high horse because otherwise that will be a long, long discussion. I want to move into my favorite, which is a quick fire. Adam, does that sound okay?
Sounds great. Let's do it.
What are the parallels between management and parenting?
Clearly, you read the article that I wrote about this. So they're the same, basically. Cultivating a growth mindset, providing choices, difficult conversations, and empathy and collaboration, goal setting, rewards. Like, I always thought of myself as a great manager. And then I had kids, and I realized that tiny humans are a lot harder to deal with than adults. And then I took a parenting class, and I realized, wow, a lot of these managerial frameworks are the same things that they're telling us to do with our kids. So it's basically the same. I think it was an eye-opening experience for me. I don't think employees love to be referred to as your children, but they kind of are, right? So identical, I think. Parallels are like they're one and the same.
You also can't fire your own children when you need to cut burn. Kids, I'm sorry, Dad wants a new
Kids,
pair of headphones. You're out. You're out. That
this
is
is true.
too
That's
good.
the only difference.
Tell me, what tactics in growth have not changed over the last 5 years?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the foundational things like psychological principles, biases, topics like loss aversion, scarcity, status. Those sorts of things are like universal and permanent. Channels come and go, but some of the like core principles around how to motivate and how to tap into emotion, like those probably will never change.
What
So yeah, those are the things.
what has totally died a death tactic-wise?
Oh, far too many things, I think. Leveraging social graphs, address books, incentivized referrals, like they're not nearly as novel as they used to be because people have like productized that. Company generated content, which you typically call like content marketing, much harder to do now. SEO, much harder to do well. They haven't necessarily died, but the bar for success is higher because there's like so many experts out there now and so much written about how to be great at this. And so everyone's competing for the same few positions.
I think
So
most
yeah,
people are
those are the
I
things.
just think most people are shit at it, to be honest. I
That
do.
could be too. Yeah.
If there's one thing that I can be arrogant around, it's content creation and media company. I might be a shit investor, fingers crossed I'm not, but who knows that? But no, media company guys, they just suck. It's
Yeah,
boring.
that's
Um,
true.
if you want to go to a school of media, cool, Adam. I don't care. Tell me, what would you say is the biggest mistake founders make when hiring growth teams?
Yeah, I think there's two. One is that it's going to be a quick fix. Growth is
Mm.
not a quick fix. It's a system. It takes time. You can incrementally win, but it needs to compound over time. And the second one is that they need growth help when actually what they're struggling with is product market fit. So if you don't have product market fit, throwing a growth person into the mix is disastrous for your product because the last thing you want to do is put your product in the hands of more people when it sucks. You almost always fail with those two expectations. So yeah,
You
don't
won't get in, or you won't get it in the hands of more people. But if an exec comes in, has bad culture, bad morale, brings down other functions, fucks up other relationships, and then naturally just
exactly.
causes internal discontent. Yeah, I agree with you.
Hmm.
What? Tell me, what would you most like to change about the world of growth today?
Oh, um, I'd really like to see a lot more companies take a holistic approach to growth. So
Ooh.
that's thinking about acquisition, retention, and monetization together as a system versus just sort of seeing growth as like an acquisition problem or we're just going to get this marketing team in here and they're going to take care of growth. So that's one thing. And the other thing is I'd like to see a lot more growth leaders like sort of stop pattern matching and build a broader skill set around understanding marketing, product and data and figuring out what the right tools for the job are instead of trying to apply the approach that they've taken at a previous company and expecting it to work 100% at their next thing. So
What?
those are
What?
two things.
What's been the biggest fuck up growth experiment wise you've had?
Oh, this is probably Patreon. It is. I actually was just talking about this at Reforge in a class yesterday. Um, we did a bunch of experimentation around moving payment processing fees from the creator to the fan, so making the patron pay for it. We tried to understand what that would do to conversion. We had a really good quantitative sense of this. We didn't talk to a single creator about it and we announced that we were rolling this out and the world imploded. The internet literally caved in on top of Patreon. That was how angry people were. There were articles written, there were apologies written. First thing we did was we doubled down and we're like, no, this is why we need to do this. And creators were like, not having it. It was named the fiasco. We did it right at the end of the year. It ruined my December. It was a very dark time for me, but quantitatively, it looked great. So we were like, yay, experiments. It was bad. We ended up backpedaling, rolling it back, and learned a very valuable and painful lesson. But it punched us in the mouth for several months. Our growth rate slowed down. Creators lost a ton of trust in us. They felt like we were just like every other tech platform, and that was like the last thing. Like we lost a lot in doing that. They have since recovered. We recovered. I kept my job. It was great, but it was pretty dark there for several weeks. So that's the biggest one of my career.
Yay, experiments. That's rough. Yeah, no, I feel for you. I'm sorry, man. That's tough. Final
It was
one.
rough.
Yeah, what one company growth strategy have you most been impressed by recently?
Yeah, I'm really impressed with companies taking advantage of new features in iOS. So things like companies like Locket, where they're taking advantage of widgets on the home screen and things like that, which are like interactive modules that you can implement. Locket is really cool. One, it's entirely product led growth. The story behind how they got started is awesome. They focus on a bunch of those principles that I talked about: scarcity of invite and sending to people. It's a super simple product experience, hugely viral, sharing oriented around photos. It's like this nice middle ground between like sort of an annoying social media broadcast that everyone turns off and a one-to-one message that has like no viral coefficient. So like I really like what that company and that founder's been doing.
What's it called? Locket,
It's called Locket,
Lock.
Locket. Yep. It's for sharing photos with your loved ones. So you and your mom, for example, mom could have a little locket. I did see that you take walks with your mom pretty regularly, so which I love. I do the same. But yeah, should try get your mom on board.
Love it. This is
Hmm.
awesome. You know what? The terrible name. Terrible name. So
We
I
should
mean,
work on
well,
that.
I'm on Twitter, can't find it. I'm on Google, can't find it.
App Store. That's where you got to go.
And wow. Yeah, fuck. They need to change their name. I'm getting love lockets now when I'm Googling locket photo. Gee, because yeah,
Well, it
photo is
doesn't.
also the worst thing.
It doesn't help. It doesn't help that in the States Mother's Day is on Sunday, and so like there's probably a lot of photo lockets like at
It's like
retail. Yeah.
I'm getting Tiffany. No, I want your fucking app. Anyway, listen, Adam, I normally have like fun on shows. This was a lot more fun. I really appreciate you putting up with me.
Of course.
And
Likewise.
honestly, you were brilliant. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.